Morning. Can I welcome everyone to the third meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2017. Can I please remind everyone, including myself, present to turn their mobile phones and other devices onto silent for the duration of the meeting. I've received apologies from Richard Lochhead this morning. The first item of business is the decision on whether to take item 5 on the work programme in private. Are we all agreed? Great. Thank you. The second item of business today is on the Commission on Widening Access, and I welcome to the meeting 3 members of that Commission. Dame Ruth Silver, the Chair, Maureen McKenna, Executive Director of Education Services at Glasgow City Council, and Professor Petra Wend, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Queen Margaret University. Dame Silver, I understand that you've agreed to make an opening statement outlining the work of the Commission.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here. I've been longing to come before you and help open up this swiftly written, slightly dense, but I think very crucial report. We had 10 months to do it in, and my colleagues were incredibly industrious and supportive. But if it's okay, I'd like to start by telling you what we found at the end of our investigations, which led us to make the recommendations that we've made. And so after literally scurrying around the whole of Scotland, and people were generous and hospitable to visits from all of us, or some of us, and came to see us from far-flung parts of Scotland to tell us their thoughts and their experience of access. And the conclusion, this is a headline, but happy to go into it in more detail if that suits, was that actually Scotland knows how to do this. Actually, it knows how to do it very well. But it is in a difficult developmental stage. The work that we came across, in some cases inspiring, was innovative in many institutions, based on a dedication, I think, to this work. And my own personal and professional standpoint is that access work is a specialism in its own right, in the way that physics and other things are. The pedagogy is important, the development of staff is important, and actually the portability of the experience via credentials is crucial to this area of work. However, the state that it's in at the moment is in some parts exciting, and in some parts very frail, and in some parts stale. And I say that because I went to every visit and saw everybody. It is heavily dependent on inspired individuals who really believe in the cause of access. It is institutionally based, so what's a terrific practice in one institution is very different from practice down the road. And sometimes there's duplicate practice, and sometimes the portability between very neighbouring institutions is not quite right. The deficit on the whole is placed on the individual learner, instead of deficits in the institutional behaviours. But the good news is there's a decade of terrific professional practice in access work, and there's layers of good professionals who just need pulling together around some overall framework. And I think that was the state of what we were looking at. To remind the Commission that we decided to go for an appreciative inquiry. So we wanted to see what worked. That was part of our remit, was to see what good practice could be taken further. So with that conclusion, let me kind of just say a wee bit to open up this report, because it, as I say, it was, I should say, I'm sorry we wrote you a long report, but didn't have time to write you a short one. It's really quite simple. So in that spirit, I'm glad to be here today, especially to open up the report a bit with the help of my colleagues who have been introduced. And the timing's terrific, because actually the report is ready to move forward with the appointment of Professor Scott. To remind you, to trail back the origins of this commission, was a statement from the First Minister who said, "I determine that a child born today from difficult circumstances will have equal access to going to university as children born in better circumstance." And the verb determine was particularly inspiring and very cohesive, I think, for the Commission. that was a good lifetime, good lifespan. So we worked with a kind of imagined horizon of 2030, and that chunked into 3 5-year plans because the development stages are different. The first one is about gathering together good practice, shaking it about to see what's good enough and what isn't and what should be removed, and then moving forward with the agenda we set out in our 34 recommendations. Just to say that 12 good people joined me around the table, and the first thing we did was induct one another. It was a very important reason, and working with the civil servants, to get the kind of commission I thought was needed to give a 360-degree look at access. Because it's not just access to education, it's access onwards to economic life. And we wanted to reflect employer views and so on. So we were able to find 12 people who were there in their own independent professional rights, but who also represented the subsystems around the work of access, schools, universities, skills development and so on, the care community, the students themselves and staff themselves. We worked in our induction phase on what the philosophy of the Commission was, and I'll say it because it's really important. There were many accusations in the press about social engineering and so on. But our philosophy is a simple one, that access work in education is simply about fairness. That it is also about a belief in academic excellence for all. And it's a social and economic good for the nation. Our working principles, we had 5 of them, were that our work would be systemic, appreciative, analytic, evidence-based and collaborative. The route of the Commission having been established, and with the commissioners in place and inducted and themselves representing something systemic, an agreed philosophy, the organising principles established, we launched a call for evidence for over the summer, and we commissioned research pro bono, given on a pro bono basis, from the universities to look at what was going on in access in Scotland. We had a working process established where we met monthly. There were themed meetings. We had visitors from the different subsystems and students themselves and the care specialists come to talk to us. Many visitors came. We made many visits into some very cold parts of Scotland in wet evenings and waiting for trains in stations. And we were absolutely available, all of us, to talk at events. I was very heartened by the number of invitations that we got from membership bodies and representative bodies, including trade unions generally and, of course, the professional unions. I asked one thing of the commissioners, that each of them would steward an interest on the agenda. So, for example, we had people working on different parts of it. We looked at SIMD with joint working parties, we had missions and so on. So there was always a steward available to talk to explain things actually to our own colleagues. And indeed, we had the induction with our own members telling us what was going on. We set up in the end a group of specialist groups, and I'll say more about that. But I want to mention them for the sake of the Commissioner, because the idea always was we will have specialist groups to advise us, and they were not commissioners, they were people from the field, and mixed people from the field in terms of sectors they came from. But we wanted to leave scaffolding for the future so that when the Commissioner was appointed, there were groups there who had explored the themes. The working papers exist, although they're not published in hard copy. So there was a dowry of something to pass on in the spirit of generativity. And of course, we had the interim and final report and then the handover. The stance we took as we did this work was, again, a simple one. Inequality is damaging, it's unsustainable and it's unfair. And it was time it stopped. The work process, as I said, was 10 months, and our organising principles with the commissioners were that they were independent, they were specialist, and they were linked backwards into their own areas of work and institutions and around our table. As I said, we tried to create the system around the table. We had arguments, unable to resolve them. Some of them will take a while, but also the timescale was very short indeed. But with the arguments, I tried to maintain a chairship of them not being personal, but being issues between the subsystems. So staying curious the whole time and trying to get on there. As I've said, we were delighted that Scotland knew how, terrific professionals and practices some groundbreaking systems. The systems here that I've not seen the like of anywhere, but they are in the institution, and modest as the institutions are, they don't get talked about much elsewhere, and that has to stop. And actually, more than anything else, this sincerity of intent. The problem you have is actually they're not all the same, they're not all connected, and some of them need refreshing. The conclusion was, innovative as things are, they are idiosyncratic in Scotland, and that needs to change. This focus on the individual is deficit, the territory of institutions. There were cities where I saw 3 summer schools, and it could have been one, and it could have been wonderful, and it could have had young people meeting people who were different from them. It is unsystemic, and it's an easy move, I think, from institution to unsystemic in planning terms. Of course, it takes time. There's a lack of portability in the system, and the data is poor to inadequate, I think. It was very hard because of the way it's organised, and that became a big issue that needs to be picked up soon. But Scotland also has untapped gifts. I'm thinking of the Open University, where deputy head teachers were able to find units of philosophy from students from very difficult areas, and they would present those to universities and actually get the credit for that. So some smashing defiance in your institutions. So the strategic shift that Scotland needs to make is clear for me. It is from individual passions to institutional change. It's from institutions to a system at work, at work together, of course, and a place being the focus of that. So people working together, institutions working together, better, I think, gets a lot of bangs for bucks. I know there's a lot of recommendations, and I've explained why. But really, they categorise, I think, into 3 very helpful categories. We talked about the leadership of this system change, including political leadership. We talked about the access is about learning. It's not about funding or cutting deals. It's really about how do you manage the teaching and learning and assessment in institutions so that actually it shows people for the talents that they have. And it's about finding the places of leverage. There were 34 recommendations. Not all recommendations are equal in my view, but there are some foundation recommendations. And let me just say what they are. There's 8 foundation recommendations. That is recommendation 1, the Commissioner and the leadership of this change, and that's happened. Commission 2 is about the framework for fair access. If this isn't about learning, if it's not about what's being taught and assessed and portable, then it's not going to work. Learning needs to be looked at and pruned and supported. It's about the framework for fair access. It's about funding being congruent with the funding for access. In time, we should not be supporting work that's not leading anywhere for the learners. Access thresholds, of course, those are separate and ambitious, but those have to be looked at because learners are presenting from very different routes and from very different opportunities. And I think we're clear about that. That doesn't mean it's not, we're very aware of the disputes, but nevertheless, the view of the Commission was that should go forward. The threshold and contextual admissions are the important ones. They need to be known, they need to be published and acted upon. Care experience, we were delighted at the instant response from government, actually on a few of the recommendations, and particularly that one. The non-refundable bursary for care experience learners is crucial as well. And the targets need to be worked out in line with this development sense of the 5-year plan. All of the other 26 recommendations have 3 intentions: to strengthen the work that needs to be done, to support the work that needs to be done, and to stretch the findings into all the institutions involved in access. I know we're going to talk about priorities going forward, and maybe I'll leave that for other colleagues to contribute as well. But I hope that opens up for you some of the thinking in that 10 months, some of our ways of working, the things we believed in, and I'm very happy to to open up and take questions along with my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dame Silver. I'm always delighted to hear somebody who says they were really looking forward to coming in front of the committee. I have a question based on comments you had made previously. It appears obvious to me that you were right when you said it simply can't be the case the large majority of Scotland's best talent happens to reside in our most affluent areas. But what evidence is there to show that the bright pupils from depressed areas can do just as well or better than their more affluent peers, even if their qualifications aren't as good?
I don't have the references to hand, but certainly the report from Sutton, some of the work done in Scotland shows that actually coming from a disadvantaged background, and I'm talking about school backgrounds as well, when these young people are treated, taught, assessed, and in the company of others on the same course, they do very well indeed. So there is evidence, not enough, and we need more of that, and that's why the sense of five-year plan, I think, is to say, let's start getting the basis for that.
I know my colleague has got a number of questions around data and stuff, but just one last question on that then. Is there any evidence to suggest the money lost to the economy because we aren't at this stage getting those people into university that could be benefiting the country?
There's evidence from other places, England certainly, about the cost to the economy of these young people, not doing as well as they could do, the sort of support systems, how hard jobs are to find, and actually some of the issues that they're facing. Again, in the 10 months we had, we didn't have enough time or staff to really get under the skin of that.
Sure, that's true.
There is evidence from other places.
Thank you.
Liz? Colleagues.
Convener, good morning. I wonder if I can pursue this issue about data. You were very clear indeed in the information that we received about some of the ambitions of what you are flagging up to the Commission, and that includes a shared understanding of the barriers. I think that's extremely important, and we've got a list here of 8 barriers that have been suggested as being really key to this issue. I'm actually quite interested in the data that supports your findings in this area, and obviously on a broader issue, how that data supports the decision by the Scottish Government to insist that universities will accept in their intake 20% from the disadvantaged communities by 2030. Could you say a little bit more about your concerns over data, which you highlighted in your own introduction and in your answer just to the convener just now? Because this committee has sat through a lot of education evidence recently, particularly about the Curriculum for Excellence, and it was a point that was raised by the OECD and by lots of experts in Scotland that the actual data that we need is not really all that great. And if you don't have the good data, it's very difficult for the committee to make decisions about scrutiny and deciding what the policy should be. So can I just ask about this data problem? What is it that we are missing that would help you better to inform this committee and obviously the wider public about what we should be doing?
I think it, excuse me, I think it suffers generally from the same disease that is not systemic. There's very good data in strands about particular sectors. Excuse me. So, for example, we were surprised to find that the exchange of data between, for example, the Funding Council and the Inspector and some of the local authorities and some of the central bodies, some of the civil service itself, there was no way of it working together. People didn't know a lot of the data that other people heard. And actually, they were, once we got them together, they worked well together. But they had never had common cause to do that before.
Can I just ask about that? Because in your introduction, you said that you thought some of the data, the collection of data was poor. Is it a question that we don't actually have the available data to hand? Or is it a question about communicating that data?
I think it's both, actually. And Scotland's been through a lot of kind of febrile time in policy change in education. So the kind of linking the early years data, I think, is now strengthened and being established. But it didn't go back far enough. So there's difference in the time scale, there's difference in the kind of concepts used behind that. And we were surprised because we certainly the team and I, trying to find some information, found that teams inside the Funding Council had the data. They had them in regional data, some of it was regional, some of it was national. So there's just something about taking the chance to have an overarching framework where different sets of data can talk to one another. This isn't just Scotland's problem, by the way. I sit in a group at the Royal Society looking at how we can bring, now that we have super data and whatnot, how we can bring that together. So it's a problem generally in England as well and in other places. But there's something that the changes have all happened. Some of the data hasn't happened. Some of the data has been developed in different ways. And I'm saying, have a look at that seriously. Institutions have their own data, local authorities have theirs, to serve the reports they have to make to their politicians and so on, and to government.
I think Professor Vend wants to come in. Could I just ask one more question, Convener, before that? I think our issue is that we've obviously got your excellent recommendations, and this is a very important issue. I don't think anybody disagrees with the principle behind widening access. I don't think there's any disagreement about that whatsoever. There are some disagreements about how it should happen. And it's very important that in that debate about how it should happen, that the data which underpins the decisions that are made is comprehensive, that it's coherent, that it's consistent, and it's as valuable as we possibly can. Because otherwise, I think we will be in danger of pursuing policies without the factual basis that we really need, and particularly from a scrutiny angle. Would you accept that?
And we had a specialist group looking at that, a joint working party with University Scotland and civil servants and some of our commissioners, and again chaired by an independent commissioner from the Sutton Trust. And there's working parties going on in lots of places, and I think they moved that forward. I know work has gone on since we finished the commission. Some parts of the system have taken that up further.
For that being available?
Maureen?
Can I come in and bring to the committee's attention? The University of Glasgow and West of Scotland local authority partners published a report in December 2016 on the back of really taking all the data that was available in drilling right down from 2009 to 2015 about impact for access, and that's sitting with the SFC just now, and I would recommend it to the committee to read.
So
it's
that
a very
will be
good
published?
report. Yes, it's published.
Yeah, I know it's published because I read it, but
Yeah.
will there be a wider dissemination of that? Because I think it strikes at the heart of what Dame Silver was saying about the issue about good data being sometimes out there, but not necessarily available to all the people who need it, and particularly not in terms of this committee.
What I wanted to add is there is a different or another aspect to data as well, which is the definition, interpretation of what deprivation means. And the report makes recommendations in terms of SMD and has got targets for 2030 and beforehand as well. And we did realize that SMD is not the right way to measure deprivation, because 2 out of 3 deprived children live in non-SMD 20 areas. And this is what we need to realize as well. And this is one of our recommendations, is that there should be a unique learner number allocated to each child, whereby we could actually follow the progression of the child through life in order to measure long-term where our successes are and where interventions can succeed. Obviously, we are not there yet. We haven't even started yet. So in the absence of that, our targets were in SIMD, but we had a special session on deprivation and data in that context as well. And University of Scotland for a long time has worked on a definition of deprivation and looked at a basket of measures. And this is something we need to take on in the absence of SIMD being the only measurable way of looking at it. Yeah.
Joanne, you want to come in on that point?
Just briefly on this question of SMID, except it's not the only measure, but did you not find that there is an issue about concentration of deprivation within a community impacting on the ability of schools to deliver services, for example, and therefore a young person who themselves are very supported, perhaps they're reasonable income in the family, but learning in that school will have different pressures than a school which doesn't have that. And therefore it is an important, I mean, it's not just about the individual child, it's a cumulative effect of deprivation on the services within the communities in which they're learning.
No, I completely agree with you, but it cannot be the only measure. There's a lot of deprivation in rural areas, which we need to look at, and they are not in SIMD 20. So we're talking about a basket of measures, which includes SIMD. We need to take it into account.
Do you accept that there is a question of the impact on a school and its ability to support the young people in the school in a community which is deprived because the pressures that are on it that won't happen in other areas. And I accept the point about rurality, and I think there are other factors that can be used to measure that, but there is a very specific question around the learner journey, which is about the pressures on that class or in that community.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Gillian, you're coming in. You want to come in at this point?
You've touched on what I was going to ask you about. I come from a rural constituency up in the northeast of Scotland. Obviously, Aberdeen University and Robert Gordon University have made recommendations to you and asked about this. Yeah, and I specifically want to ask what's come out of that discussion about where you have potential students who would qualify that are getting missed because they're not in those SIMD areas. What criteria have you added to the mix there that maybe could identify those students that may be living in a street, be living in a town that looks on the surface of it fairly affluent, but in that particular household there are issues there? I'm interested to know what your findings were there.
To add at a basket of measures, I think they included 4 or 5. Now, I can't recall them all, but low-performing schools was part of that, because it isn't always the case that low-performing schools are in SIMD 20 areas. Free school meals, I think we looked at as well. What else did we look at?
Family histories of attendance, HE, the number of pupils that schools sent on into higher education. So the school's success at higher education, parent success.
Yeah, absolutely. However, I would say that we didn't come to a conclusion that those were the right basket of indicators. You know, the Commission didn't have, as Dame Ruth has already said, didn't have the time to be able to take those indicators and be able to say, oh yeah, for sure, let's use that one, let's use that one. I think that there still is a lot of work needed done in that area, and I think there still is a view, and it came through in the evidence to the committee today, that the role of the admissions officer is still a very critical one around what a contextualised admission would be, and that relationship. And I think it's the tension between the institutional based approach, getting a systemic approach, and then allowing those individual circumstances that are really necessary to be taken into consideration. Because you're absolutely right, you know, the rural dimension is a very important one, and it's not to say that there's not deprivation and not challenges for those young people and those families living in a rural area, and therefore it's the school who would know that information, and how does the school get that link into the admissions officer? How does the admissions officer have time to sift in amongst all that plethora of information that comes in? And that's where we do need to get better at getting a systemic approach, but also not forgetting each and every young person that we want to show that has the potential out there, because that's the fairness element that comes out from the Commission.
In a view of those universities, it could look, for example, like University of Aberdeen may have hidden individuals that, because they're not identified as being from those areas, that it look like they're not meeting any kind of target that others are. I
agree with you. University of Scotland, we've already started with 3 work streams, and one of them is on admissions. And we are particularly looking at contextualized admissions, but also at the various criteria we want to use for contextualized admission. And we want to agree on a framework for that across all universities. So we are going to look further into that.
Thank you very much.
Can I just say that actually SIMD was not designed to help people choose young people. SIMD is a measure that has another intention. It's been used elsewhere. It's a monitoring measure more than anything else. And it's why we badly need the work that's going on contextual admissions. And what we've given you as examples are simply that. They are hypotheses. The work, the work needs to start. And the work that's going on, the working groups set up, are self-authorising in a way. And I'm delighted about that, because that's exactly the spirit that we need. Both groups decided, well, let's crack on with that while other things are happening. And that needs, again, it needs the leadership, it needs to be focused on learning. And SIMD is not about learning.
Tavish? Right, thank you. Ross?
The discussion around about SIMD, something that's also been discussed at the Public Audit Committee as we looked at Auditor Auditor General's report. Following that, I've had my own discussions with Aberdeen University, Robert Gordon's University, and something that's come through in those discussions is that with the current funding settlement for universities and the cap places for Scottish students, if we're going to be increasing demand and having more homegrown students going to university, there'll be fiercer competition. There was some concern expressed to me that we could displace able students. How do we avoid doing that?
Shall I kick off?
Do you want to start now? Breathe out.
It was one of the issues discussed at the Commission, no doubt, because it came up as a topic. And we decided it wasn't up to us to make recommendations as to whether student numbers are capped or not. So it was up to the Scottish Government to react to our recommendations. Now, whether displacement or not is taking place is arguable, but it is clear if by 2030 we want to have 20% of SMD 20 students in universities, it means that there are some students who would have got in, might not have got in. Now, the question whether that is fair or not is a different matter, because somebody who would have got in now with particular grades might show less potential than a student who wouldn't have got in now and who would actually succeed. So it is not right to say that we need another 20% students or places for that. So that doesn't quite work. But there is a danger that some students might be squeezed out, and it might be those who are just about getting into university. So they're the squeezed middle, so to say. So we need to look at that very carefully in all of our 3 work streams in University Scotland. So we've already addressed it. The 3 leaders of the work streams, we meet regularly to look at that as well. But all we can do is work within the environment we are working in and then doing our best.
But I want to say, because I'm independent now and I was stood down the day after we launched the report, that you have displacement now. You have displacement now. You have displacement of bright young people who don't have the right badges through no fault of their own. Scotland, in the 4 nations, of course, has got the highest percentage of advantaged young people going to university than the other nations.
Thank you. Fulton, and then very briefly after that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's just sort of second to the conversation we're having just now about the SMIDA. And the area that I represent is an area of high deprivation. And I think that for me, I don't know whether you detected when you were looking through it, it's still about an attitudinal thing. You know, when I went to, I was lucky enough to go to university when I finished school. And like a few of my friends that I went with, I was sort of the first in my family to have went. But I still feel that, you know, going around schools and going around the area, there's still a consensus among a lot of young people that, you know, no, university is not for me. I wouldn't be able to go to university. So there's that whole societal attitudinal thing. But I wondered when you were investigating the circumstances, what exactly you found in SMID areas or other areas that were preventing that. For example, welfare, the situation around welfare reform. How is that impacting?
I mean, I think you're spot on with that, actually. The attitude is a big problem. And actually some of the universities, you know, Robert Gordon, I think, has got this fabulous setup where they have pre-freshers. So they do, I mean, you really have all of the problems cracked in some place or another in Scotland. But I wanted to say that that attitude is not just about getting in, it's about staying there. And it's also about the kind of jobs people apply for when they leave. So it goes on. It can be a lifelong burden, I think, if we're not careful. It's definitely there. The young people who have broken through tackling that have done so with support for learners, as well as support for learning. But we're very aware. I mean, I did a couple of the summer schools. I actually went along as a summer school kind of learner, sat in some of the teaching. And people were saying, well, actually, these learners, they won't come to summer schools because they need to work, they don't have money. They went to summer schools and they worked hard at weekends. And actually, they themselves mentored one another on how to have more confidence, how to not be put down by the posh ones, was how one of the young women described it. But it is a big problem, and I think it's really palpable here in a way that I'm not sure. I mean, I've always worked in areas of deprivation. Access is my speciality, but I noted, instantly really how hard it was for them to see themselves in those positions. But there's work going on in early years, for example, where you walk in and the teddy bear on the desk is sitting there in its gown and mortarboard. So work is going on, reaching back down the system to take some of this stuff on, because it is a big problem, even when you have the qualifications.
Just coming back to what Professor Wen said, that we've not mentioned the role of colleges in this. So we do, I mean, this I don't particularly agree with this displacement idea, because there is always a place. And colleges, what would you say the role of colleges is in higher education? Because of course colleges do provide higher education and also a route to university for people.
The work streams that we are leading on in University of Scotland is on articulation. And colleges obviously play a big role in there. And I think that universities and colleges in Scotland can improve on that one. What we need to be mindful about is that the courses taught in colleges aren't only feeder programs for universities. And this is something that we need to find the right framework for. So those who are able to go to university should, and that should be encouraged, but we also need closer working relationships between colleges in Scotland to look at the curriculum so that it fits, because we do not want the articulation students to fail once they get into university, because the curriculum is just not matched at all. So this is again something we are looking very closely at in one of our 3 work streams. But colleges do play a huge role, but we mustn't forget that colleges also offer skills and prepare people for work and aren't just feeder courses for universities.
So my own background is further education. I've been college principal, and I am greatly admiring of the concept of articulation, and some of the work I've seen is splendid. I think Scotland's on the cusp of a risk about how it sees articulation. And it feels to me something like this, that actually it's, and you'll know that, the expansion in Scotland and widening access has been through your college system, much more than through your university system. Let's be clear about that. And it's wonderful, and I have to tell you that I brag about it in England. But there's something really wrong at the engagement end. So we found young people and older people doing the same level for certainly twice. They moved from a college into university, but actually crossed over to the same level. There was no progression in it, for very good reasons. That's why we have the framework for access. The modules didn't fit, or there was a specialism that they needed. Articulation on the whole is not portable. What you do for getting into one university is not nationally portable. It's an agreement, a compact between institutions. Nevertheless, it is a fabulous, fabulous way of working, and it worked for Scotland. But it's on the cusp of risk, as it will be seen as second class. It will be seen as not portable. It will cost more money, and people will waste money doing things on the same level, and that should not be going on. That's not right.
A case like what you're saying about the variation in the country, that there are examples of very good practice where college and universities have got arrangements that absolutely gel. Yeah.
And we teach, the university lecturers work with the college lecturers on the same programme with the same students, so you can't tell the difference. And other ones, they don't see one another.
Thank you. Fulton, very briefly, and then Tavi.
Yeah, did you find that there was any difference at all in two sort of groups? This is a bit broad brush and generalistic, the 2 groups, but groups of young people who maybe had been intending to go to university or college for a long time, possibly all their life, and if not that long, maybe for a good few years before that, and other young people who get to the age of 15, 16, 17 and realise that they need to do something because their life before that has been taken up with dealing with maybe parental issues, mental health, alcohol, drug abuse, being young carers, living in dire poverty. So maybe they've not been thinking about it. Did you detect a difference between those 2 broad groups of people?
To comment, of course, because she runs Glasgow's schools and
we didn't, in terms of the Commission, we didn't look at that level of detail. Drawing from my own experience in Glasgow, we work incredibly hard with our partner universities and colleges to pull those experiences further and further down the school, so that we don't have young people getting to age 15 and suddenly thinking, gee, I don't really know about college or university. And we've got an incredibly wide range of initiatives that are on the go. And that's one of the issues for me, is that there's too many and there's overlap, and we're battling over the same group of young people. And in order to get best value, we need to streamline. And it's back to Dame Ruth's point about institutional based. So University of Glasgow runs its summer school for young people going to University of Glasgow. Strathclyde does the same. So why is there not one summer school that gives young people access to any university in Scotland? You know, there's little things like that, but the importance of having young people and children right down from early years exposed to that broader range of experiences with their parents too. So we work with, an example would be Glasgow Caledonian run their Caledonian Club in learning communities where they work age 3 to 18 all the way through with a wide variety of experiences, but it's about making going to university normal. Actually, it's about learning. It doesn't have to be that university. It's about showing that education makes a difference to people's lives and how important that is. And family learning, you know, that's being pushed just now in a whole range of places is very important. But the families need to get qualifications. It's not just about come and learn how to read together with your child. That has a place, but if we really want to make a systemic difference, we need to encourage our families and the research evidence to show that a young person's potential is highly correlated towards mother's qualifications. You know, using that as your kind of baseline, then we need to have families who are qualified. And that means we need to be more flexible about entry. I mean, a lot of the talk is about schools, and rightly, because that's the bulk of what we're talking about. But we've also got young parents who, for a whole range of reasons, have had to move out of education. Do we provide enough pathways to bring them back into education? Is the way that we fund our college sector and our universities, does it enable fair access for people whose pathways might take them a little bit longer? So, you know, we've taken steps around care experience, but this is tricky territory. You know, that this is about individual people and the experiences that they bring. So it's not easy.
Tavish?
Yeah, thank you. You have to forgive me for asking this, but are we obsessed with universities? Are they the be and end all of life in Scotland?
Petra is.
I find myself in a position where I brag about Scotland and England, but really have to say different things up here. Absolutely. And I used to sit in, I grew up in Lanarkshire and stayed there a bit when I was here. And I used to love going in the train to Glasgow in the morning because you'd hear young people having a debate about the currency. Shall I go to this university because I get an extra year and I get work experience, or shall I go here? And I thought, you know, I don't hear those conversations in the tube in London. So it is there, and it's to our credit that people value education so highly, and less because it's a route to work here. I mean, education, it will change, but certainly education, in my experience here, is valued as being a good thing in its own right. The evidence is, of course, that more people here go on to university than the other three nations.
Yes. I will nail my colours to the mast.
Of course
yes, it is.
Of course it is. But actually, what's offered in Scotland is different from what's offered in England. There's other things going on there as well. So you have, I mean, I can talk a lot about one of the strengths in your system is the college system, because higher education, higher level skills in Scotland is stronger than it is in other parts of the country. That's because people in Scotland want to have a job. And it's always been there.
To be honest, I wasn't so worried about England. I was more worried about being part of a parliamentary committee 15 years ago who wrote reports about parity of esteem between vocational routes into economic life and university education. And you've rather confirmed that we haven't made any progress on that in 15 years, or have we?
I wondered if we were chasing, I mean, me too, and I wondered about chasing the right thing. I mean, I've become much more addicted to the concept of parity of outcome and parity of esteem. Yeah. You know, you can't dictate esteem, but you can actually measure, monitor, target outcomes. So parity of outcome, I think, is the test of access.
If I perhaps add to this one, for me, it's very much from the child's or person's perspective, and they need to have the options available to them, so barriers need to be removed to whatever the right outcome is. So if I look at the Academies program that Queen Margaret University are running, it's a 2-year program jointly taught with schools, colleges, universities and employers. Now that means that children can decide after 1 year whether they want to stay in school, whether they want to go to college, whether they want to do 2 years and go to university. But then they have the options and aspirations, coming back to your questions, are there. It is possible. So it's about removing the options. So it's not about saying, is the university be it end all. It's removing the barriers so that it is possible and that children know about the possibility. And in the same vein, Children's University as well, which we are running in Scotland. It is getting children and the parents and carers into the university to see that it might be an option, not that is where they should be going, but that it could be an option for them going into university. I lead on the bridging programs for Scotland, and if you look at the Commission, the report, it talks mainly about summer schools, but I want to widen that, and I want to look at all kinds of bridging programs, but all of them will have in common is that university is an option, and that children and parents are well informed to see what might be possible for them. And its Children's University might be part of that, going right back to a young age, 5-year-old to 14-year-olds. It's raising aspirations. And perhaps as an additional point as well, raising aspirations, this is I wanted to respond to your original question. The 4 universities in Edinburgh, for example, have already got together to look at a Raising Aspirations program together so that we don't overburden schools to get programs from all sides come up to us and we help you to get into university. So we want to have a coherent program so that schools can make an easier choice.
I was quite interested actually in a comment that Professor Wendt made, and I'd like to just confirm that. He said that 2 out of 3 young people lived in areas that we would not consider to be deprived. 2 out of 3, that seems a high proportion.
3 are deprived but do not live in a deprived area.
Okay, so 2 out of 3 are deprived but do not live in a deprived area. Where did that figure come from?
I don't know, it's research we have done as part of University of Scotland's research, working out the basket of measures for deprivation.
I haven't seen that figure before, so obviously I'm quite interested in it.
Yes, I'll dig it out for you and send it to you.
Perfect. Do you know what proportion of that is rural?
No, I'm sure we do, but I don't have it here. But I can send you, as a chair, the information, yes.
Excellent. Obviously, targeting is quite important here, and there's been a suggestion that obviously the SIMD data isn't as accurate as it should be, and that's been discussed around the table today. There's also a suggestion that we should complement that data with information from other sources. An example has been given of parental occupation, which seems to be a very dodgy one to use. It smacks a bit of elitism there. I mean, my constituency, there's not many stockbrokers, but there's lots of very well-off plumbers, joiners, and electricians. How would you do that?
Look at that in our admissions group. We are still very uncertain about all of that. We need to come up with a framework that we all understand, but most importantly, that the potential students and the teachers and the parents and carers understand as well, because that is part of the problem. We already work in contextualized admissions, but even we universities do not quite understand what the other universities are doing. So if we don't understand it, how can the potential future students understand that? So this is our aim.
And that's the recommendation about it being, the contextual admissions being published and known to parents and schools, so that doesn't happen.
I mean, I can see you picking up, for example, parents that are unemployed, but there's a huge chunk of working poor out there, people that are just making ends meet and bumping along at the very bottom. How do you pick them up?
It's not going to be an easy task.
Yeah.
It's not going to be easy.
Is it possible?
I think it is, but I think it's a mistake to look for one factor that will identify.
Yeah.
We need a system of factors that gives you the texture of the young person or the older person applying to university.
But
It's
each
the
factor has to be
combination.
robust.
Sorry?
Each factor has to be robust, otherwise you won't get the desired result.
Okay, but no, absolutely. And this is a phase of exploration of this, but in the end, it is about the compound disadvantage.
And you can't be completely mechanistic because every person is different. You cannot say, tick plumber, tick this. That's impossible. So we need to look at interviews, getting to know the person. It's going to be very time consuming, but we need to look at a more individualized approach.
But if we're looking at something that can be put in place across the country, an individualised approach becomes quite difficult.
Can I ask you?
I suppose what you're talking about is as if the person just fills in the application form and that's the first time that the universities get to see them. What we're talking about is a range of programmes with the universities, such as Queen Margaret do with their schools. So actually the universities are getting to know the young people and getting to know them from a younger and younger age. And the young people are getting to know the university. So that contextualisation is beginning to be from points of knowledge, so improving the young person and their family's knowledge, but also improving the university's knowledge of that young person in order to be able to have that contextualisation to be more robust. But it will never be if you're in that category, that gets you in, and if you're not in that category, you can't get in. What we need to do is to get that, as I come back to that difference between that tension between the systemic approach, which is needed in order to get better value from what we are delivering, and also that individual, and that requires people in schools who have better connections with universities and who know them better, and equally for universities. In Glasgow, we phone up admissions officers around individual cases and engage in conversations about those individual cases. Sometimes that results in the young person getting in, sometimes it doesn't, but on each side we've learnt more about, so next time we know more about how we're going to contextualise and get the right qualifications and the right experiences for that young person to enable them to succeed.
One of the phrases we used in the Commission a lot was the notion of building ladders down into down into the communities and schools and so on. And we saw an example at Glasgow University whereby students who'd been contacted earlier through the schools and participating in pre-university programmes were on an MIS system that identified them in a way that when they came into the university, they could then be targeted for particular deficits in their background. Actually, and it looked like it was ordinary, so they would send flyers to young people from school where there had been a problem with maths teaching, for example, to offer extra maths stuff. But it looked to the students themselves as if everybody was getting this leaflet. So that the very delicate and sensitive way of handling them before they come in and when they come in. You know, as I said already, access is not just about getting in, it's about staying in and moving on from that. It's access, success, and then progress. You have to have success in the middle. And that means people working together.
Another suggestion that's been made in terms of complementing SIMD data is level of education, but surely that's already picked up through contextualised admissions. How would that feed in when it's already there itself?
Can you rephrase your question? Because it's not part of the basket of measures.
There's a suggestion that, for example, SIMD data should be complemented by a number of other sources. For example, parents' occupation was thrown out as one thing, level of education was thrown out as another. But when I just look at level of education, I look at contextualised admissions and think, well, isn't that already being taken into account by the universities?
We were just wondering if that's the parents' level of education, not the individuals.
Well, the youngsters' level of education, because obviously somebody coming from a school in a deprived background who might be achieving less than someone from a better background could be deemed to have done better simply because of the background it came from.
Universities are already taking all this into account, but we don't do it in a systemic way across Scotland, and it's not very clear what university does what how. At Queen Margaret University, yes, we have UCAS entry points, but we do admit students who do not fulfill these points because we are looking at the overall person. So every university is already engaged in that, but it is not very clear and obvious to to the children, to the parents, teachers, and so on, how we are all doing this. And we need to become clearer with that, and it needs to be a clearer framework across Scotland.
One last question. How would colleges fit into that? I mean, how do colleges fit into this? You know, there's articulation and so on, but how would colleges fit in with the SIMD, the identifying of youngsters and so on?
Well, you know, actually, you have the advantage in Scotland of having regionalised your colleges in governance terms. So you have regional boards now that now know what's going on in the area, where they lead to. And I think that that's an enormous help. They are key in the whole ladder of access because they are focused on place. I think I mentioned that as being one of the key components. And therefore they're focused on place, that's on learners as well as opportunities for work and for study. My favourite phrase about colleges is we are the mezzanine floor, actually, in the education system. And we are not protected by the law because we're not compulsory, and we're not protected by the Queen because we don't have royal charter status. So the changes that go on in colleges are absolutely in the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I go on to Joanne, can I just remind people two things? One is supplementaries are supplementaries to the question asked, so if you want in for a supplementary, make sure it's relevant to the question just being asked, or the answer just given. And the second thing is we've still got a fair bit to go through, so could we make our questions and our answers as short as we possibly can, because we have got another panel after this.
I'll not take it personally that you said that just before
pure
I
coincidence, I can assure you.
I'm interested in what you say about colleges and what the evidence is about the benefits of regionalisation, to be honest, because I haven't seen it on the ground. But I mean, that's, I suppose, the question I would ask you on further education on the basis of what you've already said is if it's not about parity of esteem, it's parity of outcome. Do you have a view on the issue of parity of resources? Because we've seen the college sector cut. We've seen disproportionate cuts to part-time places so that young parents with caring responsibilities would not be able to do college courses. I don't know if you looked at that in your work.
Only did I look at it. I lived my life in similar circumstances. I do have views. That's what happens when you're not protected by the law and not protected by the Queen. You are the place where, actually, on the whole, politicians turn to first to bring about change and to, actually, it's not a protected budget. And in not having that, you are making great big holes in the stepped approach to widening access. Let me just say a bit about regionalisation. And I think I first met you when I did the curriculum review for the Glasgow colleges, where we looked at every course in every college and looked at my favourite phrase, curriculum intention, and found overlap and so on. And that's the gain. It's not in, the gain's not just in governance, it's in working together to make sure resources are being employed and deployed usefully, not by doing the same courses as one another, but making sure there's progression within the institution. It's early days. You know, regionalisation's a revolution.
With respect, my observation is within the community where I taught, the outreach work done by colleges no longer happens. And there is an issue for young people in some areas that they won't travel, and actually having a quality institution near them encourages them in and draws them in. And I have grave reservations now about the capacity of the college sector to do that second chance learning when we in the school system failed them. And I do think there's a big question around that. Perhaps that's a
no. I completely share your
inquiry.
concern. It's really it's a disaster waiting to happen, but that's policy led and funding led.
It's not my policy, not my government. But I do think, in terms of a question of if we're looking at access and fairness, you have to look at the way in which the college sector has suffered. Absolutely. If in your report you're saying the colleges are important, but also we'd be interested in what you looked at in terms of our schools, because I wonder if you looked at the disproportionate disadvantage even within disadvantage. So boys are less likely to do well than girls. So it's not just about income there are, and I wonder if you looked at that, is there an issue around ethnicity and opportunity as well? And did you look at dropout rates at school level? I mean, I think there are so many young people who don't even get to compete. They don't even get the opportunity to be denied a place at university because they're no longer in school.
Absolutely. Again, we didn't have much time to look at that, but we know it to be a really big issue. We looked at solutions to that. So we looked at some of the programmes in the Glasgow schools and what was being done to compensate for that. you know, if you remove the middle, it's the squeezed middle, not just in terms of individuals, but also in terms of institutions. If you lose the college sector, and the college sector, I think very cleverly, have been able to find ways of still working with young people, but that's to the credit of their creativity and good links with the education authorities and with employers. But it's not systematic.
If there are cuts to school budgets, those cuts very often come to the bits of the system that support people to stay in school. You know, there are programmes like that all over the place. Does that in itself is ineffectively a barrier to a young person learning?
It is, and it's a growing barrier.
So in terms of your recommendations, have you addressed this question of the importance of the soft supports around young people to draw them into school?
Sure. We talk a lot about the importance of learning support, but the heart of the matter that you raise, of course, is a matter not for the Commission to discuss. It's government's policies on funding and resources. And we took the decision not to talk about that.
Is there not a contradiction being asked by government to address the question of fair access and not commenting on some of the issues that may actually be creating concerns?
We certainly commented, but didn't make recommendations on it.
Well, we made recommendations that we talk about a holistic approach. We cannot just talk about admissions without talking about schools and colleges. And this is why our recommendation came to have a commissioner for fair access who might have the oversight to make recommendations to Scottish Government on schools, colleges and universities, because we had not only schools and employers and colleges represented, but also early years. And we could see it was a question from the cradle to the grave. So this is why we made these concrete recommendations that it has to be a holistic approach. But for practical recommendations, this was Commission on Widening Access to Universities. The practical recommendations had to concern universities, and that was our remit.
Okay, thank you. Ross Greer.
Dame Silver mentioned compound disadvantage. I was wondering if you could lay out a little bit what findings came from the report in relation to young people with additional support needs, because young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are proportionately far more likely to have additional support needs, which if they go unsupported, act as a multiplier to the existing disadvantage. Heard plenty of anecdotal evidence of young people with ASN not being directed towards even making an application in the first place. So I was just wondering if you could lay out what you found in relation to ASN.
I mean, it is exactly as you described. One of the successes we found, if I can just talk about that because we were an appreciative inquiry, was actually it's when the receiving end of the progression is the one doing the learning support. So to be supported by this idea of a pre-fresher summer, actually that just made things become more real. It boosted motivation. And actually there were young people themselves and also mentors from the university, people who had graduated, working with them. They saw the next stage of what they could become. And there's no way that you can do access without learning support. There's such a lot of catch-up. It's compensatory education, really, in its truest sense. But it's got to be in the hands of the right people. And I think what I saw in Scotland was compensatory education in terms of learning support all the way, not done institutionally alone, you know, volunteers in the community, all sorts of employer projects, school staff and university staff working differently. It is crucial. Don't widen participation to further failure.
Thanks very much.
Then we have Daniel.
So in the interest of time, I'll just ask one question. So if you'll just allow me just to explain.
I will do if it's going to be
so,
one question.
We've already talked a lot about articulation. I think it's very important. But in my discussions with, especially at Strathclyde University, people running the Engineering Academy, what they told me was that there's an awful lot of wraparound work that has gone in, both before students join them and actually once they've done that. Now, bearing in mind what you've said about making sure that college qualifications and indeed kind of other routes to university aren't just routes to university, the work to make articulation work has to be a lot more than just routes to. That there's actually that support that's required, both with students before and after they articulate. I was just wondering if you'd agree with that sentiment, and what investment and support do you think needs to be put in place to really make articulation work properly, both from colleges, but actually I think there's also another point around other routes potentially from apprenticeships and the wider skill sector as well.
Well, the joint articulations, of course, its origins are in vocational, technical, scientific training. And lots of the students we spoke to had no wish to go any further than just, getting the college part of the qualifications. Others did. Others came back later. This notion of portability is not just about location, it's also about time. So running a curriculum like that is really complicated. Let me say, I like the wide base of that. I like the vocational focus. There's a famous Scottish report of years ago who talked about the importance of vocational focus in widening access. The Brunswick report, it's way back in time. We looked at that. We looked at why articulation was great in some places and not so good in others. And actually we saw one attempt, I think, at articulation in an arts subject area, which didn't work quite so well. I think it's the same as some of the access work. It's grown and grown and grown. But actually it has not had the chance to be reflected upon and refined. And there are different streams within, whether people are going to go on to do higher qualifications later. So that there's a lovely, the mezzanine floor, it's a lovely pausing point to revisit the intention of the learners. Some of them did change their mind and tried work. We met some young people who had started a 2x2 course in a college, who went on to university and who did not like university and went back to the college. And the college had found a way of working with the university and the Open University to actually let that student qualify. So modular credit-based qualifications are just a great answer. Complicated to get to, though. I mentioned underused assets in Scotland. I think the Open University, and I can remember saying, you should be ashamed you're so modest, you're doing fabulous things for young people. And the credit qualification framework, I've seen some degrees being done in Glasgow with that qualification system. So there's, that's what I meant when I said it's all there in Scotland. It just has to be harvested, pruned, and then farmed, I think, in a wide way.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. Ross, do you have another question to ask?
Briefly. As well. Thank you, convener. This committee has done a lot of work looking at SQA, Education Scotland, and as part of that, it's looked at the interaction between ministers and the agencies. Joanne has previously asked questions about when policy maybe hasn't been achieving the right outcome. Has there been that challenge? Liz Smith today asked questions about the data and ensuring the data is there for decisions, particularly when we get to a 20% figure, how we got to that and how we'll achieve that. Discussion about SIMD, and I quote, not being maybe the right measure and maybe needing something more sophisticated. So my question to Dame Silver is, as the Commissioner, are you able to challenge government? And will you challenge government?
Not the Commissioner.
Sorry, apologies, sorry.
I was stood down and the Commissioner is here and right behind me waiting to come on. This thing about the leadership of the system involves government as well. The government's not outside the system. It's a very important role in that. If I were the Commissioner, absolutely yes. But you can ask him in a minute, can't you?
I will.
Okay, in that case, do we have anybody else who wants to ask a final question very briefly?
This is on contextualised.
Yes, right.
Yep. I'm very interested in this issue about contextualised entry and also on the access thresholds, which I think we've already indicated are pretty complex and it's a very difficult decision. You said a little while ago that you felt that there was lots of evidence that Scotland's already doing most of the good things, but it's not joined up and it's not universal across the system. Do you believe that decisions about contextualised entry, and particularly when it comes to the access thresholds, which are obviously a specialised part of that, do you believe that that is a matter for individual departments within universities to take, or do you think there has to be intervention from government?
Do you want to answer that one?
Well, I think that the universities, we are trying to lead on that to make the right recommendations. So we are going to be in contact with Sir Peter regularly on that one, just to make sure that we don't only work in parallel, but that we are working constructively together as well. But University of Scotland, as I said before, we already started to work stream on that one. I'm sure that we won't come up with one access threshold for each particular subject or one. So it needs to be slightly more sophisticated because universities are different, but we will come up with a framework that will be easily understood and that will be far more accessible.
I just make the point in the context that you're all supporters of the autonomy of the system, and I know that the Commissioner himself has a long record of being supportive of that autonomy. And therefore, when it comes to the decisions, which it appears in some universities working extremely well, that decision should rest with the individual institution and indeed the departments, because obviously there's different demand and supply, and therefore there will be different conditions on what that... And is that something that you're working on?
Universities are autonomous, and this is what we are continuing to defend. But we also made clear as lead persons on these 3 work streams that we don't just want to come up with a narrative that pleases the Commissioner or Scottish Government or others, but something that universities really want to embrace and do. So that is something we very fiercely believe in and have already agreed as the 3 chairs of the programmes.
I think I just want to point out that the report does actually say, trust the professionals in the first phase, this first 5 years. Let them deliver. Let them see, you know, my claim that Scotland knows how to do this. Let's see what they come up with and see what that is in 5 years' time. Because my clear view was that actually this is doable. It will need looking at, of course, and be ready for the next 5 years. But actually give people the space to do that. They are the professionals. 2 courses need different entry requirements dependent on subjects and levels. So we need that professional intricacy, I think, to be there, but also to be observable, published and scrutinised.
Okay, thank you. Tavish, did you have a supplementary?
Well, can I just, a different issue if I can? Just
I'll let Gillian in first then, Gillian. You wanted to talk about carers.
Well, I was going to ask a question about, you mentioned recommendations around people who are care experienced, but young carers as well have issues about, and I wonder, did you have any dialogue with young carers and their families?
We had dialogue with young carers as well. And again, looking at the 3 work streams of University Scotland, we are looking at all the aspects. We do not want to limit ourselves to the groups described in the Commission's report. We also want to look at part-timers. We want to look at adult learners. We want to look at carers. So that is all part of our work.
No, I'm
Tavish?
Thank you. Can I just ask about recommendation 17 about Skills Development Scotland and schools working together? Because you go on to say there that that SDS and schools should basically assist learners at key transition phases throughout their education. And I guess my question is that in order to make that recommendation, you must have had some concerns about what was currently happening between SDS and schools. Would it be possible just to elaborate on what your concerns were there?
Yes, I'm happy to take that question. We took some of the evidence also from some of the work that had gone on from developing Scotland's young workforce, where the recommendations there, as you know, were about careers advice and guidance and SDS working further down the school. And that was part of the evidence that we received to endorsing that, but also ensuring that the advice then stretched into the college and the university, that it didn't just remain within the school. And part of the discussion we just had there about the different entries, you need the data on the skills shortages, on the employment areas. That needs to feed into the university system through SDS and the various organisations in order to be able to ensure that we've got those pipelines coming through. And that may mean that you need to alter thresholds for entry at various times. But in reference to it was really about saying that SDS and their careers advice and guidance had to go much further down the school, recognising that particularly from the learners from disadvantaged backgrounds needed those interventions at a much, much earlier stage. And we didn't speak about SIMD. It was about learners from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think that I'll throw in my little bit. SIMD is a reasonable metric. I don't think we should discount it. It is a basket of indicators, but no statistic is perfect. And if you're out there looking for a measure then that's just going to give the answer to everything, then that's a lost cause.
That wasn't for me the issue here. It was actually Skills Development Scotland and that organisation being flexible enough in terms of how I read your recommendation. Do you think it is?
My view from a Glasgow perspective, no. I think they try their best, but no. No, I have.
You'd be suggesting we kept an eye on that one because that's.
I certainly
area.
do.
Thank
yes.
You. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Fulton, would you want to come back in? No. Okay. Well, in that case, and this time we have finished with the evidence. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their time and for their information today. It was very useful for us all. It was nice to meet you, and close this session, and I'll give the panel a couple of minutes while we change over. Thank you. much. The third item of business is an evidence session with the newly appointed Commissioner for Fair Access. Can I welcome Peter Scott to the committee and congratulate him on his appointment? I understand Professor Scott wishes to make an opening statement.
I'd like to make a very brief opening statement. I have made the written statement, which I hope is useful. What I'd like to say in terms of an opening statement is that it's a great honour to be appointed to this position. I'm keenly aware of the kind of burden of expectations that are pressing on my shoulders. It's a great opportunity, and as Ruth Silver said, I think there are many great examples of good practice in the area of fair access across Scotland. In my written statement, I've tried to do three things, really, to be open and frank about my starting point, my beliefs, but I hope I haven't done that in any kind of dogmatic way, and I can assure you that I'm certainly not prejudging any issue. Secondly, I've tried to foresee what might be some of the key debates, and it became apparent from your questions that these are some of the key debates. In my opening statement, I emphasised that although these, of course, have a very strong and particular Scottish resonance, they are more general issues. I mean, I think they're very familiar across the United Kingdom, across Europe, and in fact across the world. And thirdly, I have briefly touched on a number of more specific, more detailed topics, which again came out in the questions, offering a very preliminary view of those issues. I want to underline that I emphasise there are many other issues which I don't cover in my opening statement, which may be equally important, particularly in relation to student support and funding. I want to allow the maximum time for you to ask me questions, which I will do my very best to answer, of course, and one I think I've already had pre-notification of. So I'd like to really just make two other preliminary remarks. One is to say that, in a sense, the founding text of British higher education was the Robbins Report, published more than half a century ago now. It established a famous principle, which said that higher education should be available to all those with the potential to benefit and the willingness to do so. And that has been widely accepted, I think, for the last half century as a fundamental principle. So in one sense, fair access, we are pushing at an open door. I don't think I've ever come across anyone who doesn't believe that access should be fairer than it is currently. There are, of course, great difficulties about defining how we might achieve that. But also in the Robbins principle, there are one or two key words. The first one, of course, is all. It doesn't say people who have particular social advantages, people who have parents or graduates. It says all, and that's crucial. A second word is potential, that the emphasis should be on potential, and I think that leads on to discussions of contextualised admissions and so on. In the UK and in the Republic of Ireland, unlike most other European countries, higher education institutions effectively choose their students. They decide which have the greatest potential and choose on that basis. There's no automatic entitlement, as there would be in France if you passed your baccalaureate, or in Germany if you pass your Abitur, or as there would be in some American states, where if you graduated sufficiently high in your high school class, you would be automatically entitled to a place in higher education. So universities, in a sense, have always been in the business of measuring potential, although that's difficult. And the second preliminary remark I'd like to make, in a sense, is a very personal one. I recently acquired a new grandchild who's still less than 2. I can be 90%, 95% confident that she will go to university, and she will probably go to a good university. Both her parents are graduates. Both her grandparents on my side are also graduates, although, like baby boomers, we are first-generation graduates. And And my concern is that other babies born in that same hospital, that same night, I know that they will not be so certain that they can achieve those ambitions. And I think we all have a responsibility to ensure that we at least strive to create greater fairness in the system. And at that point, I'd like to stop and answer your questions if I can.
Thank you very much, and let me congratulate you on your new grandchild. That's always one of life's blessings. The final comments you made there play into my question about targeting. You said in your letter, your submission, that you saw SIMD as a sophisticated metric. There seemed to be, and I know there was a difference of opinion both round here and maybe even from the witnesses about just how effective it is. And I'm sure you're not saying that's the only method. There are other methods that have to go along with that. But could you explain to me what you see those other methods being and how you would capture them?
It's a relatively comprehensive measure. I mean, it takes into account multiple aspects of deprivation as opposed to single measures. I think there are strong links, as has already been said this morning, between areas of deprivation and lower performing schools, a much more limited range of people who have graduate qualifications living in those areas. So there's a range of things which come together to, I think, intensify disadvantage. But as I say in my opening written statement, I'm very aware that any kind of area-based metric, there are issues. They produce, I suppose, what might be called false positives or false negatives, and we should be sensitive to that. So the work that University of Scotland is undertaking looking at these areas, and frankly the scepticism that I think University of Scotland has about how appropriate this is as a measure to determine targets, I think that's to be welcomed. I think any work that can be done to develop more sophisticated basket of measures should be encouraged. But I think it's not a bad starting point, I think is what I'm saying.
No, I think that's a fair thing to say. I'm going to move on to Liz. Would like to come in on this, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Scott, I think one of the most interesting things to us, and we heard it from the panel previously, that obviously there are certain things that universities are doing extremely well just now. And there are obviously certain things where there are weaknesses and things that still need to be done. In the short time that you've been in the job, would you be able to flag up to this committee where you think there are already strengths that need to be built upon and developed across the institutions? And particularly, could you flag up where you think there are particular weaknesses that we really need to address? Would you be able to do that?
Well, I'll try. I hope I won't be unfair in any comments I make. I think the strengths are very much in terms of bridging programs, summer schools, links with colleges in relation to special programs. The major weakness is much too strong a word, but I think articulation could be very much improved, as I outline in my written statement. I think that's my broad conclusion at this point, yes. And if I could just add to that, and I think Ruth Silver made this point herself, of course a lot of this practice is very customized. It's for a particular college and a particular institution working together, often in a particular subject area, so they're very, very targeted. And I think the challenge is to generalize some of that experience, make it more compatible, so that students are not locked into necessarily a limited range of choices, that they can have a wider range of choices. Equally, I would not be in favour, I think, of trying to produce an over-centralised and over-determined system.
Yeah, thank you for that. This problem about data that we referred to in the previous session, I come back to the point that I think the data set is extremely important, both quantitatively and qualitatively, in leading us not only to be able to identify where the problems lie, but obviously to give direction both to yourself and then obviously to the Scottish Government. Do you agree that, generally speaking, there is quite good data out there, but it's not put across in a systemic manner, or Is there a lack of data? What would you like to see to be able to help inform you and allow you to do your job as well as possible?
Well, certainly there is a lot of data available. I think it's often not presented always in a terribly helpful form. If I can just give one example, I mean, data is often divided into younger initial entrants and older initial entrants, more mature initial entrants. I think in the reality we now face in universities and colleges, that's not always a helpful distinction, yet it's quite difficult to get data that is not compartmentalized in that kind of way. In terms of data at a more qualitative data at a more individual, institutional or program or subject basis, I think as the masses out there, it's often, again, very customized. I think one of the comments made in the Commission's report was that they were concerned about a lack of evaluation of things that worked well and things that worked less well. And I think it's certainly true that people who are very enthusiastic about fair access and have put a lot of personal effort and commitment into developing a program, frankly, they don't want to be told that it didn't work very well. So there's a bias to actually say this has been quite successful. So maybe we need to find ways in which we can be a little bit more rigorous in terms of evaluation, without in any way dampening the enthusiasm or discouraging people from experimenting with new ways.
My last question, Convener. I think you're absolutely right on that, and what you said earlier about the fact that nobody has a divine right to go to university, that's absolutely correct, and I think that's a great strength of the system, that it is left to the decisions among the institutions as to who has the right potential. The issue, however, comes back to this data, that if we do go down the road of more consistent contextualised entry and obviously looking at some flexibility when it comes to the access thresholds, that the institutions, the knowledge that the institutions have, and their departments specifically, is absolutely critical to making the right decision about to whom they offer a place. That's absolutely essential. Do we need to do more to allow these institutions who are autonomous, and I know you're a great supporter of that autonomy, to have a better understanding of where that data could come from?
Yes, I think that has to be true. And I think it's absolutely right that, as Ruth Silver said, we should trust the professionals. I mean, I think we should always trust people who are actually working in these areas themselves. I think the approach to contextualized admissions, the best approach, should be, of course, to leave the detailed work with institutions. And I would say not just with institutions, but with subjects. I think the key thing is to actually determine, I mean, people who understand contextualized admissions in relation to fine art will be very different from the people who understand contextualized admissions in context of electrical engineering. So it's subject expertise as much as the institutional perspective that I think is important. But I think there is value, and I hope that University of Scotland and their work will carry this forward, in trying to develop in some broad guidelines of the kind of factors that might go into the mix in contextualized admissions, and perhaps approximately the kind of weight that should be attached to them, some sort of broad guideline, not a rigid prescription by any means. So I think one should, of course, rely on the expertise of the people who are directly involved, particularly subject basis, of what's appropriate in terms of factors that might be taken into account. But I do think one wants to struggle to generalize this a bit, to make it transparent, so that that experience can be shared across institutions, and also, crucially, of course, that it becomes more plain, I think, to potential applicants, how they will be judged.
Tavish?
Thank you very much, Convener. Professor Scott, thank you for the breadth of your submission and therefore the weight of the tasks that you've obviously planned to undertake. In that context, how many days a month are you contracted to provide in this role?
I'm contracted to provide 3 to 5 days a month. I think I'm realistic. I think that probably it will take more than that. So my assumption should be that I should spend at least 5 days a month physically present in Scotland. I suspect that I might spend as much time again in reality thinking and reading and communicating in other ways with people. I think this was determined for funding reasons to put a cap on the commitment, and I absolutely agree with that. I mean,
and has the government given you a budget and range and some staff as well to support the role?
I've been inherited excellent staff who supported the work of the Commission, and in the short run they will be working with me. I am afraid I don't have a budget, so I noticed that there are references in the Commission's report to commissioning research, and at the moment I have no resources to do that. But I would certainly argue in specific instances, if there does seem to be a need for research, I would go back to the government and suggest that they might provide some resources. Equally, I think one needs to work with other research organisations to try and shape their research agendas.
And do you think the research that Liz Smith's just been asking about, and you mentioned in your submission about SIMD, is that something that you consider to be important enough to ask the government to provide some resource to do that?
Well, I think in the first place I need to do a lot of work to understand these issues better. I think it would be premature for me, on perhaps a half understanding of some of these issues, to make demands. But I would certainly think that, as I said earlier, that the search for kind of the most sensitive possible metrics, that should be encouraged as much as possible, and I see myself as playing some role in that.
Thank you. And the other question I was going to ask was, of the Commission obviously made, I forget now exactly how many recommendations, but many recommendations. Is your job description such that you are tasked with implementing those recommendations?
Well, I obviously, first of all, I should emphasise that, of course, some of those recommendations are directed to me, but some are directed to the government and some are directed to the Funding Council. So I don't. I suspect some of my responsibility might be to manage down expectations of what the Commissioner individually can deliver. Equally, I accept that the Commissioner has a key role, and that is the challenge for me. How I might work, I've given a great deal of thought to that. At this stage, clearly, I am in the mode of listening to people, meeting all the relative stakeholders, and also visiting institutions to find out on the ground what people are doing. At some point, I need to move into a more proactive mode, if I can put it like that.
For government and for the Funding Council, do you see your role as overseeing those and therefore keeping those organisations?
It's certainly my responsibility to comment on that, if I think that's appropriate. Sure. One of the few formal responsibilities I'm given is to produce an annual report, and I can assure you, perhaps preempting another question, that I would do so without fear or favour. Equally, I hope it will be grounded in evidence, and I hope it will be well informed. I hope it will be sensitive, and I think trying to establish precisely the degree to which I should become too deeply involved in things, and at what point I should stand back, so in a sense I can make judgments. I think that could be quite difficult in certain situations, and I'm the first Commissioner. Not only am I new, but the role is new. So I think, to some degree, it's experimental. Okay. I think perhaps in a year or you will have a better idea, and I will have a much better idea of whether it's worth. One thing I can promise you, I have no intention of trying to operate via a Twitter account.
It's very popular these days.
I know it is.
I hear it. Well, at least you're not a czar. You should be grateful that they haven't called you a czar, I suspect, either. Never mind anything else. One last question, if I may, Convener. If the week that you plan to spend, as it were, physically in Scotland proves to be insufficient, will I take it on the principle of no fear or favour? You'll certainly say to the government, look, I need more time to do this job adequately, given the challenges that exist.
I certainly won't demand extra resources in terms of personally, but I would certainly be prepared to take on more time. Equally, I need to be realistic. I have other responsibilities, other fixed points in my diary which I have to keep to. But certainly I've accepted this as a major commitment, and I think in my mind I'm thinking of it as a kind of half-time commitment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Ross Greer.
Thanks, Arch. Convener, this might sound like quite a broad question to start off with, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the definition of fair access that you'll be working with, because I know it's a concern the NUS have raised going forward.
That is a very broad question. And I think one of the issues is that there are many dimensions of fairness, and to some extent they come into conflict with each other. It is clearly unfair that people are categorically disadvantaged because of their social situation from having a hope of participating in higher education. Equally, it's unfair if, as a result of encouraging them to participate more, other people are excluded. So there are many, many dimensions of fairness. And I think one of the ways I can contribute is by encouraging a very open and very frank debate about precisely what fairness means. Because as I say, if it was simple, I think we would have found a solution a long time ago. I think we have to work at this in many dimensions.
One of the concerns that the NUS had raised was around the balance between getting more young people from disadvantaged backgrounds into university and the issue that's already been raised in this committee session of parity of esteem between further higher and vocational education, breaking down the privilege and the idea that further and vocational education are somehow lesser than. How do you see the balance in your work between getting more disadvantaged young people into university and creating parity of esteem between the levels of education?
Well, I prefer, I think, to emphasize higher education rather than universities. I mean, colleges in Scotland make a very important contribution and a very substantial contribution to the delivery of higher education. And I think that should be preserved. I think there are many people south of the border who might feel the pendulum has swung too far and universities have become too dominant an element. And that has added to a downgrading potentially of more vocation-orientated institutions. So the university, of course, themselves, I mean, are very vocation-orientated. So I think it's access to higher education rather than access to universities. I think we should respect the contribution colleges make, and in many ways it's appropriate. Of course, I think we should be worried if it appears that the social composition of students in universities is very different from that in colleges. But I have to say, I think you would find that also in England, that the social composition of the more traditional universities would be very different from that of the post-92 universities, which of course represent a much larger section of the university sector in England than they do in Scotland. So we should be concerned that there are not barriers. Equally, we should not say that the only desirable outcome is a kind of honours degree from a university. I think there are many other desirable outcomes of higher education.
On that cultural point, that there's a culture that parents would see, in some situations, some sections of society, parents would see their child getting an HND or an HNC as lesser than getting their honours degree. What is your role? How do you perceive your role in shifting that culture?
Well, I think the major thing I can do is not to be focused too strongly just on the university's contribution and to give greater recognition of what colleges can deliver and do deliver without in any way diminishing the kind of ease of articulation, the ease of transfer from one to the other if that's appropriate. Who knows? It might be appropriate to transfer in the other direction in certain occasions. It's very difficult. The amount that one person can contribute to changing a culture, I think, always has to be limited.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Start with a supplementary to the questions about contextualised admission. You said there's a need to make it plainer for learners. Indeed, think you need to know whether or not you've got the grades or not. And there's a danger with contextualised admission that actually that becomes less obscure. I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate on what you think needs to happen to make it plainer for learners.
Well, I think it's true that universities, although of course they will all publish tariffs in terms of UCAS points for each subject, what they require for entry, in practice universities do vary those. And they do take into account prior educational experience and social circumstances to some degree. They may also traditionally have taken into account other things which may have even intensified privilege rather than diminished it. I think it's important that people should understand what factors have been taken into account or will be taken into account. Not so that they can then aggressively game the system in terms of their own CV. I mean, that's the risk, of course, but that they have full knowledge of the factors that might be taken into account and the weight that might be attached to them. I think that's fair to people. I think it's also fair to someone who, in a sense, has achieved higher grades who doesn't get a place. I think it needs to be, they need to be helped to understand why the university actually chose another person who apparently had a lower tariff point than they did, because these other factors were taken into account. So I think it's fair on both sides. I mean, there are a number of factors which I can be taken into account, and I think it might vary between institutions, and I think it might vary between subjects. There are some subjects, frankly, in which I think prior detailed educational experience in quite a technical sense is absolutely required. There are other subjects in which it is, frankly, less necessary. So all this should be brought out, I think. But the important thing is so that the person applying to university has a better understanding of how they are going to be, their application is going to be judged. And I suspect often now, apart from UCAS points, it's pretty opaque.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely right, and I look forward to future work on that. In your written submission, you mentioned the need to look across what's happening in other parts of the UK. We obviously recently had the Diamond Review in Wales, which, as its starting point, really looks at kind of sustainable levels of student income while they're studying as being a really critical starting point, which I think is quite interesting and quite different. What do you think the lessons of the Diamond Review are for us here in Scotland, and how much will you be looking at student support?
Well, that is an area I don't particularly cover in my written statement, but I think the Diamond Review is a very interesting experiment. To some degree, it was a change of policy was forced upon the Welsh Government because the policy they had of subsidising fees was probably not financially sustainable. It also led to what appeared to be a large outflow of resources to English institutions, which, as you can imagine, Welsh institutions who felt they should have benefited from that objected to. So there are particular circumstances why that the previous approach had been needed to be modified. Nevertheless, I think it's interesting to emphasize student support rather than either higher fees with fee waivers and loans as in England or free tuition as it applies in Scotland. My instinct is there's no right model, and in a way I think it's useful to be able across the United Kingdom to look at different ways of approaching this and their different impacts potentially on fair access. But I return to one of the points I made in my written statement, and that I think fair access, or rather inequality of access, reflects much deeper cultural and social factors. And regardless of the particular funding arrangements you might have, or even whether student numbers are capped or are not capped, I think those inequalities persist and need to be addressed. And just one final comment. I think the experience from England has been that to approach this purely in terms of financial incentives, providing bursaries to students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, that often is an intervention which comes too late, and we need to address these issues much earlier, and that outreach activities, bridging programs, summer schools, all the things that we've talked about earlier this morning are actually more effective than a financial incentive of some kind. Equally, you should make sure, of course, that there are no financial barriers to participation as far as possible.
I would quite agree with those set of assumptions. I think there is a wide set of factors at play, but I think affordability while people are studying is a very important one. And on that basis, what do you see, or what role indeed have you discussed in terms of your participation in the student support review that has been announced?
Well, I mean, I know that one of the recommendations made in the Commission report was that within, I think, 3 months, work should be commissioned on the implications, the impact of student funding and support on fair access. My instinct today is that it might be premature to rush into that, although clearly it's an extremely important factor.
Okay. And just finally, I mean, what impact do you think the prospect of student debt has in terms of perceptions and then indeed kind of in terms of encouraging or otherwise people to actually go to university?
Well, you could say we are engaged in a gigantic experiment south of the border in relation to this, but equally, of course, in Scotland and in Wales, people graduate and they have levels of debt. I mean, it's lower than it would be in England, but it still exists. And I think we still have a rather insecure understanding of perceptions of debt, particularly by younger people. So far, the evidence is that for many young people, debt is perhaps not as intimidating a prospect as it probably was for me when I was younger. So I think circumstances change in that respect. On the other hand, I think we need to have a better understanding of perceptions of debt among different social groups. I think there are some people who are probably much readier to accept and not worry about debt and see how it might be funded and paid back. There are other people who clearly, perhaps because they lack that self-confidence, it's a much more intimidating prospect. So I think it's much more about perceptions of debt than equally, I don't think it's fair to expect someone to graduate from university with effectively a second mortgage already to pay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross.
Thank you very much. Daniel Johnson's touched on the majority of questions because I have the Diamond report here and met with Sir Ian recently. I suppose my question, to not cover the ground that Daniel has, is the report was quite clear that in moving from sort of the tuition-free grant towards improved maintenance support arrangements for undergraduate students, particularly those with the highest level of grant support covering the full costs of maintenance, so for all their sort of their living costs, they said that they felt that this could help support widen access as well as retention. And would you reflect on that as part of the report, the annual report that you bring forward, in terms of when we are looking at learning best practice from across other parts of the UK, rather than it just be something which is just covered in this committee, but maybe something that you would reflect on as you go forward and as you report back to government?
I certainly would, yes. I mean, I think that's a key aspect. I'm sorry if I'm being a bit tentative. I think it's simply that I don't want to claim understanding I don't currently have. And I think this is probably the area in which I have most to learn. But I agree. I think this is a key area. I think comparisons across the UK are very valuable. I will certainly keep in touch, and I already know and have met my approximate equivalent in England, the Director of the Office for Fair Access, who's a former colleague. And I think certainly I will share as far as possible any lessons that could be learnt. Equally, I think in the case of Wales, I think the Diamond Review is, as I said, an extremely interesting experiment, although at a very early stage, and that might yield very interesting information as well. So I will certainly address that topic in my annual report. Yes,
Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. And something that was quite interesting about the report was actually the reaction from students as well. They seemed to welcome a lot of the suggestions. And you've already preempted one of my questions in response to Liz Smith. So I do take that sort of as a genuine commitment that when you feel that maybe policy isn't always achieving the objectives it's set to achieve, that you'll be fairly robust in highlighting that to government.
Yes, I'm very determined to maintain my independence. All I can say is if the Scottish Government have any doubt on that count, they have not done their preparatory work very satisfactorily, because I think I have a reputation for being independent. Equally, I hope I will be sensitive. I think my role should be challenging, but also very supportive and very respectful of the work that is currently being done.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Gillian, did you have a supplementary?
You just say that the task that you've got before you surely is made significantly easier, given that Scottish students wanting to go into university do not have the burden of potential debt of having student fees, and that's one barrier that's been removed that actually does have an effect on the people that we're trying to target getting into university.
Sorry, could you just rephrase
Yeah, so
that slightly?
we have a situation where you're dealing with widening access in a country that does not put tuition fees on its students for higher education. Would you agree that that's actually going to make the widening access agenda easier to achieve?
I would say in very broad historical terms, providing free tuition does on balance produce fairer access, but it's by no means a simple equation. And I think it would be a great mistake for anyone to conclude, and I don't think anyone in Scotland is concluding this, that simply because tuition for Scottish students is free, that somehow that has solved the problem. There are many, many other issues which I say have other sources. But I think I have no doubt that that is the right starting point. I have to say that even regardless of my own personal views, I think that is the starting point, and that has to be the starting point, because it is a policy of the Scottish Government, and it has been the policy of the Scottish Government under different political administrations since it was established. And in practice, it would be very difficult to move to a different kind of system. As conversely, sadly, I would say, it would be quite difficult now in England to unscramble, retreat from a system which is dependent on charging high tuition fees. And I think one has to accept that political reality. But in terms of my own personal beliefs, I think the Scottish approach is much more likely to promote fair access in the longer term than the approach of the English government acting as an English government, the UK government acting as an English government.
Thank you.
Please me no end to talk about independence and now about English government. Sorry, I'm abusing my position as convener. Sorry, Liz. Joanne.
Can I say, first of all, there was two things particularly said in your opening contribution in your papers that I really welcomed. The first one was to put it in context of a child, two children born, one with not guaranteed opportunity, but reality is the fact that for too many of our children, their life chances are determined by the time they're 5. And I do hope that, where it may not be your particular remit, that you will continue to have that in your head, because I think it's so important in terms of government policy more generally, and it's not going to be sorted by some kind of system of making it fairer for the ones who actually manage to get through the process, but recognise that we lose so much potential all the way through the system. But the second thing I really welcomed was the fact that you said your work would be evidence-led, because my contention that education policy in Scotland and evidence-led policy are completely different things, and I would hope that you would recognise that. And we've just heard it round the question of tuition fees. And I note your personal view, and you've said, but I wonder if you are still open to the fact that you will look at that policy in terms of its perhaps unintended consequences. Because if you're looking at it in terms of evidence First of all, the universities tell us it's underfunded. Secondly, it's cross-subsidised from fortunately having students coming from across the border who do pay fees. Thirdly, it's rationed by a quota. There's a cap on the system, and I'm told that it's more difficult for a young person in Scotland to go into university now than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, precisely because of our system of funding, and it's funded at the consequence of cuts to college education. And I wonder, do you have a role in looking at that evidence and either saying, if you want to call it free education, you're going to have to put more money in, or you're going to have to recognise there's a balance there if the resources remain the same?
Yes, I think to some degree I can make those points. Equally, I think I have to accept, and I do accept, that these are political decisions, that the Scottish Government has to establish its own priorities, and has been elected on that basis. I think I naturally, of course, would argue for increased expenditure on higher education and education more generally, but I'm very aware there are people who think the National Health Service or other areas might be a priority. So although I think additional resources would be very welcome, I think realistically we have to accept there's always going to be some limit on what resources are available, and the choices in terms of priorities are ultimately political ones. You mentioned the cap on student numbers. I know there's quite a focus on that in Scotland in terms of the impact it might have in terms of displacing students, Scottish students. But I've tried to emphasise that I think in a sense that there are always going to be constraints on capacity in any system. So issues like displacement notionally, logically can arise in all circumstances, I think. I also should point out that it's only this year that the cap on student numbers in England has been fully removed. It's very early days to see how that will work. So to imagine, I think, that simply by removing the cap or raising the cap significantly, that will solve all of our problems in relation to fair access. But I absolutely accept that we need additional resources, and I would, if I feel it's appropriate, make that argument.
The argument is the way in which resources are shared, and of course the capacity is there. It's just simply that Scottish students can't get those places because of the way in which the tuition fee policy operates. And I should add that actually our young people are the most indebted. Disadvantaged students in Scotland are more indebted than in other parts of the United Kingdom. But you say that's a political decision. Is it not your job to challenge political decisions that are not evidence-based? But if you know, there will be a contention about what I've said around the evidence. But is it not your job to say, you know, you're describing this as one thing, which is free tuition. In fact, the consequence of it means there are other consequences, particularly around access, I would contend. Is it not your job then to say, you may want to make that political decision, but you will make it in the knowledge that it is contrary to a policy on fair access and opportunity?
Certainly my responsibility to point out the consequences of both the student cap and the level of overall funding. But the decision obviously lies elsewhere. But no, I certainly think it's correct that I should point out the consequences and the evidence that supports the conclusions I've reached.
I suppose really what I'm keen to hear from you is a recognition that a decision which has consequences in terms of access ought not to have the credibility of a label of free education if it's counter to what we're looking at. I mean, rather than simply saying, well, that's not a matter for me, that's a decision for government.
I think I should certainly look across a very wide range of policies. I think I end my written statement by saying you should try to make all policies sort of access-proof. You should evaluate, even if it appears to be in an area comparatively remote from entry to higher education, you should try and make some kind of assessment of what the implications of that might be, positive or negative, in relation to fair access. So I certainly think it's my responsibility to try and increase the sensitivity across all areas of Scottish Government to the impact of their policies in terms of fair access.
To be fair, I mean, I think probably everybody here would want to be in a position to support what you have said, which is you value higher education for everyone, and it's difficult to just see how that fits in with a tuition fees policy. Can I just, one last wee point on ground access? Will you be looking at the 4-year degree in Scotland and its necessity, given that many young people now say that the first year of university is very similar to the 6th year at school?
Well, I think it would be very bold to suggest a kind of total reconstruction of the pattern of undergraduate education in Scotland. After all, we should recognise that Scotland is the standard across Europe and across the world. It's England and Wales that are exceptional by having a shorter undergraduate degree. But I do accept that you do need to ensure that the kind of any overlap between final years in school and first years in university is managed sensibly. There might be instances in which high-performing students might be given some form of advanced standing. But in general terms, I think the fact that you have a 4-year degree gives a flexibility in Scotland, which is not available in England, where you have a rather narrow range of possibilities. I have to say, I don't think they've always been, that flexibility has always been used, certainly in relation to articulation. My understanding is that roughly half the students with higher nationals who then transfer to a university are given no credit, no advanced standing at all for that. And in fact, the proportion is rather lower in England, despite the fact that they would be effectively coming into perhaps the final year of a degree program rather than just year 3. So it should be easier to manage articulation in Scotland than it is in England, where there's a shorter degree program. So I think one should encourage a degree of flexibility, perhaps in some circumstances, a limited number of circumstances, by allowing some form of advanced standing even for first entry students from school. I think certainly that flexibility should be used to improve articulation and make it more common. But I don't think that it would be sensible for me, or even to recommend any wholesale changes in that. I think on the whole, I think it's a great advantage which should be used more commonly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Liz, supplementary.
Professor Scott, could I just ask for a clarification on that, and notwithstanding the fact that, obviously we all have different views about higher education funding, and not asking about that difference of perspective. Given that your title is Commission for Fair Access, do you believe that within the current system that there is a problem as a result of the fact that different categories of students, whether they're domiciled Scots, European, international or rest of the UK, because of that categorisation, do actually have different perspectives when it comes to the payment that they make for the university? Some are obviously paid for by the government, some are paid for by their own means. Does that concern you? And I'm not asking for views about the future of higher education funding, but does that concern you about fair access? And just to take up the point that Joanne Lamont mentioned earlier, where by the competitive edge for the places, there's a knock-on effect for that competitive edge because of the capped system, which doesn't exist for some students. Would you actually look at that aspect of it?
Yes, I think certainly we should be frank about that. It's not a new problem, as I say in my written statement. I mean, it's a problem in a sense that it existed for at least half a century in relation to students from outside the European Union. But a new dimension of complexity has been created, I agree, by the decisions, or rather the different decisions taken by the UK government and the Scottish government in relation to tuition fees. So yes, that produces areas of potential controversy, and they do produce areas of fair complication in relation to fair access. I see the primary responsibility of this role, and I think it was the prime focus of the Commission, to focus on fair access for Scottish domiciled students. I don't think I have any remit to make access fairer for students who come from England or Wales and attend Scottish institutions, although I accept that the kind of social composition of those students does change the flavour and affect the culture of at least some Scottish universities.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Colin?
Thank you, Vera. I'm just looking at some of the figures that the NUS have been providing us with. And they're looking at the ancient universities, it says that only 6% of students at ancient universities come from deprived backgrounds, moving from college to university. There's 113 students quoted here as being involved in this. 91 are made to start again in the first year. Does that, and 10 more are made to duplicate a year of study. Does that seem fair?
Well, on the face of it, it's not fair, but I think we always have to start from where we are rather than where we should be. And I have to say, I think if you went to the most famous American universities, or Oxford or Cambridge, you would find a very similar pattern, that there would, on the whole, be a limited number of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, despite the great efforts those institutions make to search for those students and to welcome them and to support them when they enter that institution. I think rather than commenting in detail on specific universities, I think I'd like to make the general point that I do think it's important that the institutions with the most privileged social intakes have a responsibility, a kind of leadership role. I don't think it's appropriate to say, well, this is taken care of by post-92 universities or colleges. I think the responsibility is for the whole sector. And in a way, I think perhaps Edinburgh or St Andrews or whatever institutions you might have in mind maybe have a heightened responsibility to exercise some leadership in this area. I have to say, I think they do make major efforts. I mean, I was in St Andrews last week talking to the new principal, and they had organised a conference which brought together people concerned with fair access from across Scotland. And I was very impressed by their commitment, her personal commitment. And I know that St Andrews do have some quite interesting programs. So I wouldn't expect everyone to approach fair access in the same way, but the statistic you give, yes, is a very alarming one.
Looking at across all institutions, it says that 51% of articulating students are forced to repeat years of study, which seems a very high proportion.
It does. It seems a high proportion to me, and as I said, I think it's a higher proportion than would be the case in England, despite the fact England has a shorter degree programme. I think there are two areas of concern there. One is, of course, for the individual student. They are effectively prolonging their education, so issues of debt and worry about entering the labour market and so on and getting a job. They're worse for them if they're being forced unnecessarily to prolong their education. And secondly, of course, it's a waste that if you're duplicating a funded place which could have been available to another student. So I think more could be done to improve that. I think sometimes universities will start from the position that a higher national student is sort of guilty until proved innocent. It has to be proved that the experience they've had in their 2 years articulates sufficiently well with the university programme for them to be allowed on. I think we should try and shift that round and say, on the whole, it's innocent until proved guilty. That on the starting point should be that you should be given advanced standing and appropriate credit for that, unless there are compelling educational reasons in relation to particular subjects why that's not appropriate. And, of course, there will be midway positions. But
in the interests of fairness, is this an area that you would be very much looking at?
yes, I think articulation between colleges and universities, which I would have expected the performance in Scotland to be superior than in other parts of the United Kingdom, actually appears on the face of it to be rather less good. So I think it's an area that one could work on.
Groups like the NUS say that articulation is a success story, but clearly behind it there are other issues that perhaps need to be addressed and looked at in the interests of this widening access and fairness of access.
Yes, no, I agree.
Thank you very much. Fulton, do you wanted to come in?
Thanks, Convener, and welcome to your post, Professor Scott, and I wish you a lot going forward. I think that this has been a very interesting discussion today. I suppose a lot of the points have been covered, but I suppose what I would like to stress again and ask you is you know, a similar question to what I mentioned in the previous panel. For me, it's about making sure that people have choices. So I think there is, and it was raised, I think, by Tavish Scott already, that maybe there's almost an obsession with university, or even college or further education as a whole. But I think what I would like to see is that people, you know, young people across the country have got choices, and that you know, that they whatever they choose, they feel that they're on an even keel with everybody else. And I know you've talked about it, and you've answered it in different parts from specific points to other members, but I wonder what your overall thoughts are taking that forward.
Well, I certainly think you're absolutely right that you shouldn't indicate that there are standard ways of success and there are routes which are inherently less successful. And I would certainly resist very strongly any suggestion that a college experience or the courses and qualifications gained through a college are somehow inferior to those gained in a university. I think that would be wrong. I think the key, though, is to make sure that people have the correct information to make choices. I think that people start from the same position, so they have the same chance of realizing, or reasonably similar chances of realizing the choices they would like to make, that they are realistic choices for them, as I say, to level the playing field. But I think it would be very unfortunate in the process of pursuing fair access, you narrow down the choices that were available to people. Because my guess is that looking into the future, there will be a proliferation of different pathways that students might follow, apprenticeship modes of various kinds, a whole range. So I think we have a much more diverse range of pathways that people follow. So fair access shouldn't be narrowed down too much to success in a particular way.
Yeah, and have you got any scope or plans to do any work with the sort of the business community, or you know, through the you know, apprenticeships and modern apprenticeship scheme, anything like that? Is that on your radar to look at as well?
Well, I think it certainly should be on my radar, yes. And as I said, I think I should try to resist as far as possible seeing fair access simply in terms of access to universities and maybe to particular kinds of university. That's important, but that's only one aspect of fair access. Fair access, as you say, is trying as far as possible to respect the choices that students might make if they're following less traditional routes. One thing, it's not at all a criticism of the Commission's report, which I think is a wonderful document in most respects, but it is focused very strongly on younger initial entrants. And I think mature students, adult students, and part-time students, people because of their circumstances need to study in a more flexible way, they also need to be addressed. So, yes.
Yeah, and
I think in a way I need to try and cover as much as possible, but also I need to be realistic about I mean, clearly there are certain agendas that people wish to see progress on, and the Scottish Government has established some targets which and of course the Funding Council itself, in terms of outcome agreements, establishes effectively targets for institutions to meet. But I don't think we should be too constrained by these particular targets. I think we should try and see fair access in a very broad and open kind of way.
And I appreciate that those were very broad questions, but I also acknowledge that you're just in post, and I do actually genuinely look forward to perhaps you being back in front of the committee at some point in the future, and when you've had more time to develop in the role, and I'll be keenly interested to see how that's going. Thanks.
No, I recognise I'm very clear that I'm offering very general answers to answers that really should be much more specific. And I certainly need, I think, to think hard about, certainly in the first year, the areas I should focus on. And I would hope to determine 3 or 4 areas I'd like to focus on and make that publicly known, that those are the areas I intend to focus on, without losing, I think, a sense of the need to encourage a kind of debate about what fair access means.
Thank you very much, Professor Scott. I'm sure that the next time we have you back, we'll be asking you questions about those particular areas of interest. That closes the public session. Can I thank Professor Scott for his time and his evidence, and wish him well in his new post. Thank you.